Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Dan, and I'm the Executive Director at SPARC, Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk, turning critique into promise how situationalism can aid qualitative interviewing. I'd like to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. We are thrilled to have joining us on this Vassenden, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Stavanger in Norway in the Department of Media and Social Sciences. His research interests include social class, child welfare, housing studies, and ethnic relations. And his work in these areas is informed by interactionism, cultural sociology, and qualitative methods. And Mangset is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Oslo in Norway. And her interests are political, economic, and cultural sociology, elites, public administration, and the legal profession, state and market relations, and the relationship between expertise and power. Methodologically, she focuses on comparative approaches and qualitative methods. We are thrilled to welcome you and to dig into your fascinating work on situationalism.
Thank you. Then I'll try to share my screen.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting us here. We're really thrilled to be here, we too, that you have noticed this article and found it interesting. We're really happy to talk about it, and we hope that we can exchange a bit afterwards and hear your thoughts about these issues that most quality researchers encounter at some point. I'll just go straight into the talk, and then Anders and I will switch a bit which parts we talk about, and we'll open up questions at the end and discussions. So we started out with some kind of puzzle that we came across during our common engagement in certain studies on culture and equality in Norway and studies of bureaucracy, where when different interview studies on the same topic or on the same empirical field offered seemingly contradictory findings, how do we deal with that? Or when interviewees are inconsistent throughout an interview, or when there are contradictions within an interview, we wonder, are such findings simply an indication of the lack of value of interviews? Is it a sign that we can't trust them? Or what do we do? How should we understand such contradictory findings? What does it say about the interview as a source of knowledge? And while we were puzzled, and Anders will come back to these empirical findings that brought this puzzle on to us, there was a debate going on that was picking up some old questions, but it was nicely treated in the journal Sociological Research and Methods, where Joe and Kahn published an article in 2014 where they argued that interviews can't really deal with the attitude behavior correspondence problem. The fact that there might be no connection between what people say and what they actually do. They might say one thing and do completely other things. They said that this means that interviews can't really provide data about behavior or about meaning without what's actually going on just in the interview. And they were building on an interactionist tradition, and Bloom, Goffman, Garfinkel, and so on. And they pointed to how signification and actions are belonging to situations rather than individuals. Situations are the basic unit that we need to attend to, and that interviews represent such a situation, and that's what we must focus on. Could you click on this? And further a couple, yeah. Although Joe and Kahn brought up this issue, there was this article published, and it was really nice that Sociological Research and Methods, this journal, they published several responses to this article. So if one reads that entire section in the journal, one can get different viewpoints on this issue. But this basic interactionist tradition that they built on, that was a classical thing, right? It wasn't something that came up in 2014. So they built on this interactionist tradition about seeing the interview as a social encounter, as its own reality. And we want to delve a little bit into that because that those basic insights that they built on are key to our argument, the nature of the problem and what to do with it later on. The interviewer is a social encounter. The interviewer and the interviewee, they need to agree about the definition of the situation, about some kind of common ground, establish a consensus in order to build meaning out of that. Could you just, so that meaning is constructed in the interview situation. And if the meaning is constructed in the interview situation, what can you draw as conclusions from that about the world beyond? So that's the situational critique. The interview as a method, it fails to generate knowledge about the world beyond that specific situation, beyond that specific encounter. It only says something about that reality which is constructed there and then. And well, to this, Jerome and Kahn, they simply conclude that we must drop interviews and stick to ethnography. Or it seems like that's one of the conclusions from their critique, that in order to actually capture behavior, you must just do ethnography. Yeah. One can say that, but is ethnography really the solution to every sociological problem, to all kinds of research questions that we have? Not necessarily. There are very pragmatic problems like feasibility. Some contexts can't be studied with observation because there are problems of access, for example, due to secrecy. There might be political situation with security policy issues, or in private firms, there might be secrecy issues too, which make them, they don't let outsiders in. There might be vulnerable persons and so on, that problems with studying ethnography. And also, people live in multiple places, in multiple sites. There are some very well-known ethnographic studies that take place in total institutions, in asylums, prisons, schools, and so on, boarding schools. But much of people's lives takes place all over the place. So it might be difficult to conduct an ethnographic study and follow multiple people over several areas. There's also the problem of time. You can't do ethnography on the past. So if you want to study, for instance, now, if you come a bit late to the party and you want to study how people behave under the pandemic, you can't do it now with ethnography, but you can interview people about it. There's also a question of choice between depth and breadth. Surely, if depth is what you need to do a really in-depth study of one ethnographic site, can be fantastic and a great solution, and do absolutely say that ethnography will be the right answer to many questions. But in other contexts, you might need more breadth. Maybe you want to compare various groups of people or have some broader number of people involved, and it's difficult to follow them around and to get the kind of breadth through ethnography. And also the situational critique that's directed against interviews, it's also valid for ethnography. A site where people act will also be a situation where meaning is constructed there and then. So even though you do ethnography, you still have the problem of how can you confer from that specific situation to other situations. Fabry and Troy, they suggest that if you do multi-sided ethnography, and of course that can also be a great solution, but sometimes you don't have the time, resources available to do that, and then interviews may be a more efficient way. So it's sometimes for pragmatic reasons and sometimes for substantial reasons, interviews are a better suited tool to answer your research questions. But then we still have this problem about the situational critique of interviews. So we went to the textbooks and tried to look at what people have written there about these issues. And in the textbooks, you have a range of authors talking about different ways of perceiving the interview. Silverman talks about the difference between a positive perception, an emotionalist perception, and a constructivist perception of interviews, where the latter is the one he supports, where he says that the interviewer and the interviewee construct mutually the reality in the interview. So that's very much in line with the situational critique of interviews. And both Hammersley and Atkins point to this radical critique of interviews, understanding them as encounters that fail to provide knowledge about the world beyond that specific encounter. So they point to the problem, but they leave it at that. They don't really follow up what to do with that problem. further, there is also Qual and Brinkmann, who speak of the interviewer as either a miner who just digs for the truth somewhere, the true meaning. If you just do it well, you will find the truth. But they also say that you can think of the interviewer as a traveler who does a journey of co-production of meaning together with the interviewee. And they also rather support this constructivist version understanding of interviewing. Holstein and Gudrum also speak of either the interview as a vessel of knowledge, where you try to get the truth in somehow, or as the interviewer and the interviewer as co-constitutive forces of meaning making. Right. All in all, they all argue for a constructivist understanding of interviews, which doesn't necessarily fit completely with the situational critique, but there is very much in common with these understanding and the idea of the interview that the situational critique presents. But even though they say that, they state that, they don't really address the problem. They just leave it at that. And so when we really went through this literature, there was very little about, then what do we do about that? What kind of consequences, what kind of conclusions do we draw from that about how to interview, how to analyze, and what to do with it? Could you please click on, So faced with this situational critique, we see two major pitfalls. One is that you can discard the interview completely, altogether, like Kahn and Jelmack suggest. But as we argued, that can be problematic. And the second is that you don't address the problem, that you just leave this problem of the possible discrepancy between what you do and what you say, and about the possibility of getting knowledge about something beyond the interview situation. You don't do anything about it, and you just say it's constructivist. I find that's a problem. So for all of us who still want or need to do interviews due to specific research questions or specific practical situations or whatever, where does that leave us? What do we do about that? And that's where kind of our ambition is with this article. We try to turn the situational critique into a valuable tool in order to get better data and better analysis from interviews.
Yes, and that is where I take over and dig into the flesh and meat and the empirical examples that we rely on and try to interpret and make sense of, or the puzzles of contrasting findings. And we engage, as Martha said at the introduction, on studies of culture and class in Norwegian sociology, which has proliferated for the last 2 decades or something, where sociologist research inspired by Bourdieu and/or Michel Lamont. And we find typically a lot of different or contrasting findings. And what seems to be a common backdrop is Norwegian or Nordic egalitarianism, which I don't think is that Norwegian or Nordic at all, but it's the ideology of sameness, ideology of equality, expressed emblematically through the universe, generous welfare states, etc. And there's been a lot of discussion in Norwegian sociology about the relation between this cultural repertoire of egalitarianism and on the one hand, and cultural boundaries or distinctions, class distinctions on the other. And all seem to agree that egalitarianism is somewhat of a common good, as Boltanski might call it, in Norwegian society. Some sort of cultural backdrop that we all have to justify our positions and opinions vis-a-vis. But yet the same findings or the same methods, which are interviews, have yielded very contradictory findings. On the one hand, and these are the two examples that we relate mostly to, is Ove Skarpenes, who did a study modeled on Michel Lamont's big study, Money, Morals, and Manner, of the upper middle class in France and the US, did the same with Norwegian upper class people. They find basically a very non-elitist and non-hierarchical upper middle class, which show very little disdain towards other social groups. On the other hand, is another sociologist, Vegard Janes, who also did interview studies, but shows this egalitarianism to be a true backdrop, but it's coupled with elitism and class condescension. And this is where we try to use situationalism to make sense of these contradictions. Why do we have these contradictions? Well, the same method, does the same method producing different findings? Would that mean that, say, the method in itself is faulty or flawed, or perhaps one of the researchers did a a poor job in interviewing people. So here are some examples then. This is Vegard Janes interviewing a male journalist. And they talk about elitism. The journalist says that I'm elitist. And I was not. I'm marked by having spent considerable time at the university and frequenting what the Progress Party is, the Norwegian right-wing populist party in parliament, and what they would classify as the cultural elite. I demand that people I'm surrounded by are conscious about themselves, their surroundings, and society at large. And I expect them to be able to discuss politics, Bob Dylan's discography for that matter. And if people aren't interested in such matters, what's the classical definition of an idiot? It's people who don't care about politics, and et cetera, et cetera. But if I'm supposed to communicate with others, I expect to talk about more interesting stuff than gardening, doing up houses, and what the kids said at the kindergarten yesterday. I want to talk about more than just privacy. So this is clearly a person who he belittles people who have other interests, like popular interests in popular culture. He shows a certain disdain of people who are not up to his own intellectual standards, if you will. Now compare that to these people. Here are some of Ove Skappanes interviewees. First one, they're all three. I'm going to show them all at the same time. They all answer to questions about what being intellectual means. Now, that is something negative. It's bookworms. It gives negative feelings. It's professor-like in that direction. And then a woman says the term itself implies that some are higher ranking than others. And it's exclusionary. Another one says extremely tiresome notion. That's a cultural elite that are cultural snobs. Those who have been in academia too long and don't know reality. They are condescending towards those who, for instance, like that's a reality program like American Idol. So these are people who clearly disagree with this one. And this person would probably a representative of the people these people criticize. Now, would this mean that they are come across completely different people? That might be. Or is it the fact that one of them did poor interviews, like having heavy social desirability feeding into their interview? We think neither. Now I'm going to have the two quotes on the right there for you to follow. I'm not going to read them again, but you can have them as just for validation. Or could it be possibly that these are only partial truths? Could it be that they are interviews that are contrasting situations that relate to different situations in real life, and that it's possibly reflecting of a social duality in middle class identities, which have been shown in other research? I'm going to show an example of it found from a study that I was involved in myself. A duality that kind of shows that middle class people and upper middle class people in Norway and abroad, or beyond Norway, are both thinking about egalitarianism, getting along with all sorts of people, and interested in cultivating their own cultural capital. But these are very tricky, elements of social life to express one at the same time. Now, there's this dog who is part of the economic elite in my city. He's executive in the petroleum industry. And he talks also about the word intellectual. In my social circle, we never use that word intellectual because we know that it's not understood, it's not accepted. But when I use it now to you, I guess it has to do with what kind of conversations you can be in and feel comfortable and good. Now, and the interviewer, my colleague, asks, why is that word not used freely? I almost don't use the word academic either, except when you sit here now. It probably has to do a bit with that we are taught as Norwegians in good social democratic spirit, not to emphasize differences, because that creates difference. And that is something I hold dear. Now, in a sense, this interviewee, he talks about both the same things as you can see on the right hand. He talks both about intellectualism because he says that the conversations that I feel comfortable and good in his own social circles, those are the people who hold intellectual or have intellectual capabilities or hold intellectual interests. But it's certainly something that can't be expressed easily without those social circles or without beyond those social circles and those circles of trust. So essentially what he's saying is it's important that my friends have intellectual capabilities, but please don't tell anyone. That is what he's saying. Now, how can we reconcile these contrasting findings? And that is where we argue that situationalism holds quite some value, that instead of rejecting them or neglecting situationalism, the two pitfalls that Marte was talking about, we can put them to active use, and it can actually help us solve some of the contradictions that are at play in these different findings. Now, interactionist microsociologists, they typically think of social situations as some sort of reality in itself that has some sort of independent existence. We cannot reduce it to either what we carry inside as personalities or what we gather from the surrounding cultural universe. And that is kind of Goffman's interaction order concept. And he argues here that we should focus on not men and their moments, but rather moments and their men. This is what methodological situationalism, which is a very different type of sociology from, say, attitudinal research or Bourdieuian research or the embodied dispositions reflecting of the class structure, etc. But if we try to analyze interviews as interaction ritual, where interactors will tune into what Goffman calls a momentarily shared reality, and we think of conversations in general, and in this case, interviews, as small social systems that has boundaries and which all interactants, interviewer and interviewee alike, come under pressure to adhere as small little temporary cults, be it, which will follow from the interviewer and the interviewee's joint definition of the situation or their working consensus. We might get some way to understanding what happens. And we're trying to translate that to these two quotes on the right-hand side here. Now, as we see it, the working consensus and the interaction ritual or the temporary little cult of Janne's interviews is something like this. Now, let us agree that as middle-class people, intellectual issues matter to us. And having agreed upon that, while still acknowledging that others will regard this negatively, now let's have some fun at the expense of others. And possibly, or as we conceive of it, because there is a lot of emotions happening in both these different quotes. One is annoyance. In Janne's case, it's annoyance with people who talk about the boring stuff the kids say, or the funny stuff the kids say, and gardening and stuff. Janne Skarpenes interviewees, they are very annoyed or indignant with people who look down on those who appreciate popular culture. But also in Janne's case, we also sense amusement. This is someone who has a little bit of fun of breaking with what we can call an egalitarian taboo. The working consensus differs because in the interview with Skarpenes, the competing little coach is that let us agree that as middle-class people, it matters that we get along with all people. And having agreed upon that, let's identify the threats to people getting along. And that is intellectualism. These are different realities that the same people, we argue, can tune into, as shown in the case of our interviewee. Let's just check this one to remind you of this one. But he tunes into both these realities at the same time. But doing that, it's not much enthusiasm to sense from it. Whereas these people on the right here, now it's getting a little bit messy in my presentation. I'm sorry about that. These people on the right, they certainly are getting enthused about what they're talking about. They're getting aggrieved and amused. And also the emotional displays on different points, they suggest that these topics matter to them. Now, we argue that it's probably good to go beyond a very simple dichotomy of front stage and backstage in this case. That we argue that what is front stage and what is backstage, and thus social desirability, will depend on what is the working consensus. And the working consensus in Skarpenes interviews, as we interpret it, we weren't there, so it's interpretation. It's tolerance and getting along with everyone. Whereas in Janne's interviews, the working consensus is being culturally competent and playful. And that means that they are actually in different types of front stage situations. Whereas Janne's interviewee is possibly in a front stage situation of displaying cultural competence and playfulness. Then Skarpenes interviewees, they are in a front stage situation of showing tolerance. And as we showed, and as we gather from the research field itself, both being egalitarian and being knowledgeable are cherished qualities, or have different legitimacy in different social situations, like in encountering someone from within your own group or in your own class contra someone from a different class. So we argue that these contradictions in and across interviews, they will mirror contrasting situations in the lives of our interviewees beyond the interview. And that's where we suggest this twin concept of imagined audiences and imagined communities. And we theorize or speculate, or what will you, that that's what happened in these interviews. They tapped into different social situations beyond the situation, beyond the interview situation. And that's what encapsulated in the one in italics here, that different social situations will engage different social communities and audiences and mobilize different cultural repertoires. If we see that Vegard Jane's interview, he is certainly in a front stage intra-class or intra-group situation with Vegard Janes, whereas Skapene's interview, they are probably more like what would resemble a public situation, or what will my viewpoints look like in the public? Yeah, or in a different type of private situation that is like cross-class or whatever, or what, not whatever, but what will you, or what have you?
Yeah, then we'll bring in another example, which is not included in the article. It was in an early version, but it got lost on the way. But we thought that it could be interesting too to talk about how we deal with contradictions within interviews. So not only between different interview studies on the same topic or similar types of interviewees, but the same interviewees, and within one and the same interview, you can get contradictions. This is based on a study that I did on senior civil servants or elite bureaucrats in Britain, France, and Norway about their professional norms and identities, among other things. And could you just click on thank you? There is a debate in scholarship and public administration about whether these big reforms, such as new public management-oriented reforms and so on, have changed the professional identity and norms among bureaucrats in public administration in various countries. There are lots of study of these kind of things. And so one of the questions that I posed is, do the bureaucrats today resemble a classical bureaucratic ideal close to what Max Weber described in his ideal typical bureaucracy of the importance of being rule-bound, procedural, having routines, a hierarchical structure, impersonality, lack of enthusiasm, stuff like that? Or are bureaucrats today very different? Do they rather embrace an entrepreneurial ideal with being more result-oriented than procedural-oriented, right? A different kind of bureaucrat who just wants to get things done. So in the interviews, I asked firstly in the beginning of the interview very direct questions about the professional identity, about the professional norms. And to those kind of questions, the interviewees had this kind of self-presentation that was rather strong about what I want to do I want to make things happen. I just want to get things done. And some of them explicitly said, I'm not a bureaucrat. I'm not at all a bureaucrat. I don't have time for bureaucracy. We have to be efficient. So it looked more like this entrepreneurial ideal in a way. But then at another time in the interview, I asked more indirect questions, very descriptive questions in a tradition after James Bradley about practices. Can you describe a day at work? What are the first things that you do? And through the description, then they describe the practices, and indirectly through those descriptions, they also conveyed professional norms that were very different from these entrepreneurial ideals that I had said before. So they describe very classical bureaucratic ideals about being rule-bound, about procedurality, about routines, about the value of having a hierarchy structure, double-checking things, and so on. So you have this clash within one of the same interview between rather different and to a certain degree contrasting professional norms. And then one could ask, what kind of meaning is there in this? How can we understand this? This inconsistency, does it make the interviews worthless? What are the bureaucratic professional norms among these bureaucrats? rather. So we're trying to use the situational analysis to make sense of it. In much previous research in political science on public administration, several have also found these kind of contradicting ideals, but they just end up saying that there are mixed professional norms, and some of them kind of talk of a hybrid professional identity, but without really saying something about how this mix of norms is meaningful, other than it's being a mix. It feels a bit unsatisfactory to me. And can you just click on a couple more, Anders, please? It is surely a point of departure that people are inconsistent. We can't expect people to be completely coherent, but still, this inconsistency isn't necessarily random. So we must try to understand why people express these diverging ideals at different moments. So we will try to ask, how is the situation constructed when the bureaucrats present themselves as entrepreneurs? And how is the situation constructed when they convey these adherence to classical bureaucratic norms? And one can imagine that they speak to different audiences. At the point of the interview where they say, I want to make things happen, I'm not a bureaucrat, I don't have time for bureaucracy, they were asked very directly about their professional identity. What is your role here? What's your role in the system? And then we're analyzing it as the interview represents a broader public, a more general public in our society, in a society where there are strong norms about being active, having agency, interfering, not just being stuck in routines and rules and procedures. So the cliché of the bureaucrat is not something people want to identify with. They don't want to be the source of red tape. So talking to the wider public, they don't want to be a classical bureaucrat. They want to be an entrepreneur. But when they're asked about these very concrete practices during the day, then the professional norms that indirectly come out at that time, they are more about the norms that they share with their colleagues and within the imagined community here or their colleagues. Those are the norms that they adhere to. So if we analyze it as the situation being constructed differently at different points of the interview, what kind of signals do they give about which community or audience that they refer to at these different points, we can better understand why these different professional norms come out. Yes.
Yes. And that is where I take over and also try to land this presentation with some take-home messages and some practical advice for situational interviewing. In terms of trying to carve out what are the implications here, how can we put this to use within our paper? I think we need to distinguish between two different circumstances of research. One is the case where you have a sample of interviews at your disposal that are not produced with the kind of explicit situationalism in mind. Like the case of the two studies that we already have produced, the middle class example and the bureaucrats, they were not conducted as with situational awareness. In that case, a situational awareness or a situational interviewing pertains specifically to interpretations. Now, like when you encounter contradictions, like these differences in Martha talked about with the bureaucrats or between studies like with Skopnes and Janes. But when we turn, perhaps it's also, or not perhaps, it is also essential to try to carve out the practical advice for how do we plan and how do we conduct situational interviews and how can we take these kind of situationalist, interactionist insights, which we don't neglect because we try to save the interview as some people, and we don't reject the interview because we want to be hardcore interactionists. How can we put them to use when we try to plan and conduct our situational interview? There are several things we can do. One is to do situationally oriented pilot studies. We make a case in the paper about Seamus Khan's study of privilege. Seamus Khan is one who wrote the talk, is one of the authors of the Talk is Cheap paper. And he argues also from his ethnography of the St. Paul boarding school, elite boarding school in the US, which is a total institution and therefore feasible for ethnography. But if he were to do a follow-up of his study of this St. Paul alumni in adult life, he could not possibly do ethnography. What he could do is to shadow a few of his participants and try to make up the different social situations that constitute their lives, and then take that into the full-blown or the full-scale interview studies. And by doing that, one could also make heavily re-argue that using vignettes, situational vignettes to describe social encounters is something that is happening. And these have, in terms of the things we're talking about as interactionism or situationalism, the vignettes can have some possible ways of alleviating the front stage or the moral stakes or the cultural stakes. And two ways it happens. One is that if you introduce a vignette, you introduce a kind of a third person in the interaction between interviewer and interviewee. And that means that it possibly, because the interviewee can now talk about someone via a proxy, not him or herself, but the person in the vignettes, which is transferable to their own opinions and viewpoints. But it possibly alleviates some of the moral stakes in some interviews. But it's also something else that it does is to change a dyadic situation to a triadic or imagined triadic situation. There are three agents at play. And using these vignettes, you can toy with audiences and communities. And say you come across a study of someone being ashamed of what they do for a living, like someone with a low status occupation dropping off their kid in kindergarten and being very reluctant to tell people with high status jobs about what she does for a living. Now, then you can toy with who are these other people and how would that change matters? One thing that one should always do, but which qualitative researchers very often or most often do not, is to validate your interpretation. In our case, situationalist interpretations with people in target, both among your own interviewees and with other people. Like, do I understand it correctly that this situation, blah blah blah, etc., etc. In conclusion, we argue that what is most often thought of as a restriction or a limitation of interviewing, that is the theoretical apparatus of interactionism or situationalism, which most critics see mostly as problems, they hold much value to interviews. And that is one of the take-home messages, to try to raise this situational awareness and try to use the insights, theoretical insights from interactionism and microsociology to raise our situational awareness of interviews. And what do you say, Marte? Am I probably not good on time in terms of going into, I was going to talk about some research that I'm doing, but I think maybe, what do you say? Should I drop it?
Yeah, maybe we should leave some time for discussion.
Yeah, exactly. So by that, I just thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll start with our participants and see if you have anything that you want to talk about. Otherwise, I have lots. Okay. If you think of anything, feel free to just flag in chat. Oh, Elisa.
I was just going to say thank you so much for your time. I work in public health in program evaluation, and a lot of my work is regarding people of marginalized groups. And so the power balance is often a real struggle, and situationalism, I think, is a new area of acknowledgement. Like you were saying, it's a problem, but not always understood a solution. And your take-home messages were things that were percolating in terms of questions that I had about implementation of utilizing that sort of framework for understanding how you interview and ask questions in that power dynamic struggle. So I appreciate your time and the take-home messages. It's a really good conversation. No questions, but just thanks.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. As you saw, there aren't any quick fixes here. It's not if you read this article now, this problem goes away, but hopefully it can help a little bit on raising the awareness and getting some small tools to at least work on it and get a step or two further.
Exactly. There are no quick fixes, and we don't pretend to solve problems. Or we solve some problems, don't we? But not
yeah.
problems. We don't solve
all of it.
problems, but maybe alleviate them a little bit.
I'll say for our part, I think that's why we were really excited about your work, is because those of us who have done a lot of interviews feel this all the time.
Exactly.
The insider-outsider paradox amongst who is the interviewer. I've done, many hundreds of interviews with adolescents, and how radically different it is if we're sitting in a room and they have to stare at me versus if we're walking or talking. And even within that, I very much feel the co-constructed reality of the interview. And so when I was reading those critiques, I had that, that's me. I totally agree with that. I get that completely. And then all of the problems with it. And then the other part of it that was really resonating with me is because we do a lot of work with youth and a lot of work in terms of what kinds of programs work to address the poverty, juvenile crime, things like that, child welfare systems, I end up looking at a lot of psychometric scales and a lot of interviews that the whole foundation of the interview is to have people judge their own behavior and use that as the benchmark for if a program is making an impact. And I've engaged in a lot of discomfort about that over the years. And I think this has helped me to be able to start to articulate the nature of that discomfort and begin to at least get some glimmers of some of the ways to be able to think about looking at issues like mental health, substance use in a way that is more situational, that gets at the complexity of the contradictions within people's own experiences of themselves, let alone what they're willing to show to someone who's showing up in a room with them and asking them to talk about their most intimate aspects of their life.
Yes.
It's very nice to hear this because I can completely recognize it. That this is not an abstract discussion itself, even though we found it really useful to go into Gottman and to go into some very theoretical methodological discussions. It is, like you say, something you feel when you do interviews. You encounter it all the time, and it's hopefully there is some value in just trying to articulate what that discomfort is about. And some of the things that we suggest here, it's not probably many I've thought of them before, but not necessarily framed like this. And it's not magic in the sense that we're used. That's to me the kind of the hallmark, the great thing about qualitative research, that we are aware of the biases that are there. We are aware of the constructedness of things, and we try to show it to the reader, the ways in which it is constructed, so that the reader can look at it and judge for himself. And that we also, during the research, think about in what ways may this have impacted on our analysis, and what have I done to counter that or to deal with it in a way. And we do that about the researcher position. There are lots of aspects of the research where we're trained in that, but strangely, in a way, we're not that trained in it when it comes to this. In which way was the interview situation constructed? And that can be something, as Anders said, that we're not necessarily so aware of while doing the interview, but we can try to reconstruct it afterwards. But we may also at times try to do it very consciously while interviewing and construct it in a specific manner. So there are different ways, but it's just sending a classical ideal in qualitative sociology into a new aspect of it.
No, I agree. And I agree. It's not like these things haven't been discussed. And it's not all, because all the suggestions that we make are standard techniques like matching or not matching in terms of ethnicity, race, gender, class, what have you. But it's putting things together in terms of what does that do to what kind of a situation that is constructed that we feel is the contribution of this piece. And also, as Martha said, and anything will have weaknesses, and social desirability is a major one. But what we also argue is to try to work with social desirability what is social desirability in this specific situation, and can we make that play to our strength in a sense, or to its strength? Because a social desirability is there for some social reason, because it mirrors some sort of social interaction somewhere in the world. And but thank you.
I think one of the things methodologists to set themselves against other methodologists and say, my method's better than your method. But I thought it was interesting. You do a lot of program evaluation, because I find that on the applied research side, at least in Canada, it's almost standard practice to say, yeah, we can't do one of these. You have to have participant observation. You have to be able to see how things are functioning within the situation. And you have to do interviews to be able to go in depth. But the actual process of bringing those together in a thoughtful way and how you relate that information, I think you're starting to fill in a gap in what happens when you bring together these more kind of ethnographic practices and the observation with the interviewing, which of course often is less than ideal in the way that it is constructed in terms of the amount of time you have, the level of ability to build trust before you dig in deep with probing questions, all of those kinds of challenges that show up practically over and over again within interviews.
Yep. Yes, but I think what we're writing here is, despite I think we have all the same challenges within applied research in our part of the world, but still, I think these things have value for applied research as well, because with all the limitations, you have to do 20 interviews in 2 weeks and do them, and that is often the nature or sometimes the nature for applied research. But still, then there are things that take home messages, we think, but it's always a balancing act, isn't it? Because you can only do so much, but just being aware of these issues also perhaps gives us, and that's something we didn't write about Mangset, but there is also some take-home messages for evaluation of qualitative research here. Like when you act as viewer, you can use bits and pieces of this to evaluate other people's work. Maybe. Yeah.
I know we're coming up on time. Your last comment made me think we have a couple pretty major initiatives around research data management and keeping track of the ability to replicate your work. And the conversations about that in Canada relative to qualitative methods are very nascent. They're, for the most part, people have no idea how to do that, nor whether it's desirable.
Here. Yep.
This idea of the sort of fundamental location and place and time of any qualitative experience, the situation of it. We've been exploring this idea of what it looks like to take the concept of metadata, which is produced entirely by computers within quantitative work, and apply a framework that looks at going well beyond a code book and the whole range of context and situation that is warranted to talk about within your qualitative method in order for people to be able to evaluate, probably not replicate, but at least be able to evaluate and think about how they might apply what you're doing in another context and compare. Because the fact that you could do a comparison study, I was, oh, wow. Okay. Because I knowing my field, I was like, I don't think I could do any comparisons because the ability to be able to know if they were actually talking to similar people or any of that kind of detail just isn't there in most of the papers I read.
Yeah. No, I agree.
We're actually writing a book, but unfortunately in Norwegian, with some colleagues at my old research center now, about specific challenges related to applied research. And when you do research on your own profession or on some context that is particularly close to you. And one of the chapters is written, because it's a multidisciplinary book, and one of the chapters are written by anthropologists who reflect about the issue that you bring up here and about how there is this tradition in anthropology for going back to a site either the same ones or other ones, going back to the island or whatever, and then doing a new ethnography at the same place. And again, I would say that as long as you are very conscious about those impossibilities of replicating and about what the differences are and so on, there are loads of possibilities of doing that with classical qualitative studies of various kinds. But it's all in not thinking that comparing or getting up at the meta level means that you have to think in any way like the quantitative ones. Sure not, but you can still do things rigorously and innovatively and interestingly. But I don't know if it relates to what you said, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it does completely, that there is this sort of space to do something very interesting in that realm. Takes us figuring out some of these very practical elements about how you both apply things like situation and then document it. That if those elements aren't in place, you can't begin to get to that meta level within qualitative.
I'm really sorry, but I'll have to let Anders finish up because I have to be somewhere I talk towards. I'm so sorry, but it's been a great pleasure to be invited to this and to meet all of you. So I hope to see you again sometime. And just leave to Anders to finish up.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
No, thank you for coming, and apologies for running late.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And
Thank you.
again,